It was a dark and cold night, typical of a region forgotten by time, where the trees, tall and imposing, seemed to whisper ancient secrets. The wind, icy and relentless, cut through the skin, and the moon, hidden behind heavy clouds, barely cast a faint silver light over the damp earth. In a small, remote village, where everyone knew each other and rumors spread quickly, there was a cemetery that, like any other, was a place of mysteries, but for some reason, it instilled greater fear among the locals. They said that the San Miguel Cemetery was cursed. It wasn't by chance that the oldest inhabitants avoided talking about it, and the young ones, when passing through it, would quicken their steps and glance back in fear of being followed. But what truly sent chills down the spine was the story of Amelia, a woman who, according to whispers, had disappeared there more than 20 years ago. Amelia was a beautiful and lively young woman, but with a restless and curious temperament. She lived with her grandparents, and thanks to them, she had access to the oldest wisdom and secrets of the family. When she was a child, her grandparents always told her to never approach the cemetery after nightfall. There, the rest of the dead is never peaceful, her grandmother would say, her eyes full of concern. However, Amelia's curiosity was greater than their warnings. That night, she was determined to unravel the mystery surrounding the cemetery. She knew the stories about lost souls, graves that opened by themselves, and shadows that walked alone. Amelia believed it was all superstition, inventions of weak minds. So, after dinner, when everyone was distracted, she grabbed a lantern, put on a dark coat, and headed toward the cemetery, certain she would return with a story to tell, once and for all silencing the voices of superstition. Upon arriving at the cemetery gate, Amelia felt a shiver run down her spine. The iron gate was slightly open, creaking as if it had been waiting for her. The air smelled of damp earth and withered flowers. She walked forward, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick grass covering the forgotten paths. Around her, the graves were covered with moss, and the tombstones, with names already erased by time, seemed more like shadowy figures than tributes to those who rested there. As she walked, Amelia felt watched. The wind blew harder, making the trees move in a strange way. She tried to push away the sensation that something was watching her, but as she advanced, the discomfort grew. She stopped in front of an ancient tomb, the most imposing of them all. The inscription was worn, but she could read, Ana Maria de Souza, 1873–1911. Amelia crouched to examine it more closely when suddenly, she heard a soft sound, like a whisper. Her body tensed, her heart raced. She quickly turned around but saw nothing. It must be the wind, she thought, trying to convince herself. She continued toward the center of the cemetery, where there was a large tree, said by the locals to be the meeting point of restless spirits. When she got close, a feeling of ice filled her hands. She felt a pressure on her chest, as if someone was watching her. The lantern flickered, almost going out completely, but Amelia didn't give up. She decided to take a quick look before heading back home. It was then that she noticed something strange, a small grave, seemingly newly made. The problem was that there was no date or name on the tombstone. It was as though someone had buried something there but refused to give it an identity. Amelia, driven by curiosity, approached. When she touched the cold stone, a wave of pain surged through her body, as if an invisible hand pressed her to the ground. Suddenly, a shadow formed in front of her. Amelia took a step back, her eyes fixed on what seemed to be a human figure, but the silhouette had no defined shape, as if it were made of dense fog. The shadow began to move, slowly and ominously. The air grew heavy, and she felt a presence that made her tremble with fear. She could no longer move, as if paralyzed by an ancient spell. The shadow, now more defined, began to approach. Desperate, Amelia tried to scream, but no sound came out. When the figure was just a few inches from her face, a low, harsh laugh echoed in the air, and then the shadow spoke, with a voice that seemed to come from a nightmare. "You shouldn't be here, Amelia. Your curiosity will be your doom." At that moment, fear overtook Amelia's body. She tried to run, but her feet felt heavy, as if the ground was clinging to her legs. The figure came closer still, and Amelia felt an intense pain in her chest, as though her soul was being ripped from her body. With a desperate effort, she finally managed to free her feet and ran, not looking back. But as she passed through the gate, she tripped and fell, hitting her head on the cold stone of the ground. Everything went dark. The next day, the villagers found Amelia's body at the cemetery entrance. Her expression was frozen in a mixture of terror and pain, as if she had seen something unimaginable. But what truly astonished everyone was the fact that, deep in her eyes, something was reflected, a shadow, a figure no one could identify. Over time, Amelia's story became an even stronger legend in the village. But the San Miguel Cemetery was not forgotten. Some say that, every night, a shadow wanders among the graves, waiting for someone curious enough to challenge the dead. And perhaps that little nameless grave will finally gain an identity. Until then, the wind will continue to whisper, carrying the echo of a story that will never be forgotten. Months later, a new wave of disappearances swept through the village. Young people, like Amelia, began to vanish, leaving nothing behind but a trail of fear. It was as if the cemetery had become a kind of portal, calling those who dared to approach. At first, people thought they were merely accidents or that some kind of kidnapping was occurring. However, as the number of disappearances increased, a terrifying theory began to spread: Amelia's spirit was taking revenge. It all started with a man named Marcos, a skeptic who, even after the events related to Amelia, did not believe in ghost stories and spirits. He had moved to the village in search of a quieter life, away from the big cities and the hustle and bustle. Upon hearing the scary stories, he decided that it was all mere superstition, a tale to frighten children. Sure that he could prove that there was nothing more than logical explanations behind the disappearances, Marcos decided to conduct his own investigation. One moonless night, he took a lantern and headed to the cemetery. Unlike Amelia, who was driven by naive curiosity, Marcos had a stubborn determination to debunk what he considered a hollow legend. Upon reaching the gate, he felt a cold breeze touch his face, but he wasn't intimidated. He moved forward confidently, ignoring the trees that seemed to move restlessly around him. The feeling of discomfort grew as he ventured deeper into the cemetery. The graves, covered in moss and engraved with the names of people who no longer existed, seemed to watch his every step. Marcos felt a chill as he realized that the ground was colder than usual, as if he were walking directly over a block of ice buried under the earth. He stopped in front of one grave. It was the same one that had drawn Amelia's attention. The inscription, also worn by time, didn't say anything of great importance. However, something seemed oddly out of place about this site. A slight breeze stirred, and Marcos's lantern began to flicker. He crouched to get a better look at the ground and saw something curious, a small handprint, as if someone had tried to climb out of the grave. This made him hesitate, but his skepticism urged him to press on. That was when he heard, in the midst of the silence of the night, a low sound. Like a distant whisper, but impossible to ignore. Marcos lifted his head, his eyes scanning the cemetery. Nothing. The feeling of being watched was instantaneous. A coldness gripped his body, and when he glanced to the side, he saw a figure, a shadow, moving slowly among the graves. It wasn't a person, nor an animal. It was as though the very air was contorting, creating a human-shaped, ethereal form. Before he could move, the shadow approached quickly and silently, stopping just inches from his face. Marcos was paralyzed with fear, his breathing rapid. The figure now appeared clearer, and that was when he saw it. The shadow's eyes were like black holes, empty and deep. The presence was overwhelming, as if the space around him had disappeared, trapping him in a dimension of pure darkness. The figure's voice cut through the silence, but it wasn't a human voice. It was a tortured whisper, something like a distorted echo. "You shouldn't be here, Marcos. This is the place for those who challenge oblivion." Marcos tried to back away, but his feet didn't obey. He was trapped. The shadow extended its hand, and the moment it touched his shoulder, an unbearable pain spread through his body. Marcos felt as though his soul was being torn from him, and it was as if his body were just an empty shell. In the next instant, he woke up, lying on the ground in the cemetery, breathing heavily. When he stood up, he realized that the cemetery had changed. The graves were gone, and the place seemed like an endless plain, covered in thick fog. In the distance, he heard heavy footsteps, as if a crowd of beings were approaching, but when he looked, there was nothing. Marcos tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was trapped in a parallel reality, an endless prison. The shadow, now stronger, appeared before him once again, and before he could react, he heard a scream that echoed across the land. It wasn't just Emilia's scream, but the screams of all the souls who had been drawn to that place. Each one, a life interrupted, a mystery unsolved, all united in a single lament of anguish and pain. Marcos, filled with despair, finally understood what had happened. The San Miguel Cemetery was not just a resting place for the dead. It was an abyss, a meeting point for lost souls, where the living were drawn to never return. The shadow he had seen, now clearer, revealed itself as a familiar figure. Emilia. Or what was left of her. She looked at him directly, and in her gaze, there was nothing but a deep emptiness, as if she herself were a victim, condemned to perpetuate the cycle of suffering. The wind howled around him, and Emilia's vision began to distort. She merged with the shadow, until she disappeared completely. The last sound Marcos heard was the whisper of the souls, calling his name, summoning him to join them. The next morning, the village woke up with a sense that something was wrong. Marcos was never found, and the cemetery was once again silent. Emilia's story was still told, but now with an additional layer of terror. Because in that cemetery, the souls of the curious, the challengers, continued to wander, waiting for the next victim to cross their boundaries. The San Miguel Cemetery was not just a place for the dead. It was a place of lost souls, destined to wander forever in the darkness, waiting for more victims to feed a cycle of pain and vengeance that would never end.